Hey guys, here we are for Chapter 2, Section 3, Making Informed Decision. Your essential question: describe the 4 steps in making a simple environmental decision-making model. Through this lesson, we're going to go through and get to the steps of the model, then I'm going to take you through an example. I do not need you to take detailed notes on Michael and how he goes through it. I definitely need you to get the notes in the early part. I need you to get the actual 4 steps down, and then I'm just going to carry you through an example. So most of the lecture is going to be me going through the example, but please do not take copious notes on Michael's example. I'm not going to have a question about specifically how Michael made this decision, but you do need to know how to make the decision and at which point you need to follow what steps. It is important to have the example in your head, and so you can run through it like a flow chart for a conceptual model, if you will. First key term though, values and the environment. Now, scientific research is an essential first step in solving environmental problems. We need to know what they are, in a sense. Before research can even begin, an examinative values is usually needed. Now, values are principles or standards that an individual considers to be important. And there are a lot of values that affect an environmental decision-making system. And there are many values that affect the environmental decision-making. Not everybody shares the same values, or we have a certain set of values, but this one's more important to me than that one. Somebody may be more concerned with the economic impact on the community, and somebody may be more concerned about the environmental impact on an ecosystem. They're both values, they're both valued, but they can be different. But we do have to look at what the values are. A decision-making model is a conceptual model. It's going to provide us with a systematic process for making a decision. Now, when it comes time to vote, this is the big one. You think, oh yeah, I have to vote for the president, or I'm going to vote for the mayor, or the governor, or a city representative. Well, when you go to vote the first time, you can look at that ballot and go, oh my goodness. They send out sample ballots and you have to pay attention, because you're not just voting for the president or a state representative or a senator or a mayor. You're voting for school board representatives. You're voting for a circuit judge. You're voting for a county commissioner. You're voting for things you didn't even know were supposed to be voted for. And there's almost always some environmental issue on the ballot. And this is where we cast a vote. And we, as the people, say we want to do it or we don't want to do it. And you need this environmental decision-making model. You need to look at the issue ahead of time, so when you show up to vote, you know which way to vote. You're not making the decision right there on the spot, because sometimes the way these things are written can be a little funny or fuzzy and you're not exactly sure what they mean. So you want to do your research ahead of time. So we apply this decision-making model. It can help you make decisions about the environmental issues, which oftentimes can be very difficult. I am putting the basic model up here as a little picture we're flowing through. Basically, you're going to gather information, get as much information about it as you can. Then you can consider the values. Which values are important to you? Now, you want to look at values in general, but ultimately you're the one making the vote. We're trying to say, what do most of the people think? So look at the values that are most important to you. Explore the consequences. If we did this thing, what would happen? If we didn't do this thing, what would more than likely happen? And then you make your decision. So that's it for the simple model, but you want to make sure you go through each thing, not just, ooh, what do people say? What is the information? What values do I need to consider? What would be the consequences of either one to these values? And then you make your decision. Let's go through what some of these are. Gather information, watch news reports, talk to experts. Now, experts. Most of us don't have experts right beside us all the time. But you know what? In my neighborhood, There's a guy down the street that's kind of on the far right of things, and there's another lady that's sort of far leftish. And you know, when there's issues coming up, I'll find my way, I'll walk around the neighborhood and I'll say, hey, what do you think about? Now, they may not be an expert, but I know that they're reading and paying attention to this side of the opinion or that side of the opinion. So they might not be experts, but they give me an interesting take on what this side is thinking and what that side is thinking. I have to take both of that with a grain of salt because I know it's kind of influenced by one viewpoint. May not be an expert, but it's a pretty interesting way to gather some opinions. Now, secondly, I have to consider which values I'm going to apply, because every situation doesn't have the same set of values to it. If I'm talking about the extinction of a species, well, the value can be very different than if I'm thinking about, do we want to turn this set of woods into a park, or do we want to turn the set of woods into a shopping mart? Now I may have to consider economics a lot more than should we do something to save an endangered animal. What values are there? And it may not just be values to me, but I may have to think about values for the community at large, because that's what it's affecting, the entire community. Then I want to explore the consequences. Okay, if we did this, because maybe it is an endangered animal, but they're looking at different ways to go about saving it. And then we have to look at those. So I have to look at the consequences. If we do it, this would happen. If we do that, that would happen. And once again, I'm going to run through an example of this in just a minute. And then I want to evaluate all of the information. I'm going to look at what the information I got. I'm going to think about the values that I'm doing about. I'm going to look at the consequences of each action, and then I'm going to make my decision. Once I make my decision, I have to live with it. Here's our hypothetical situation. I need you to watch and know how he moves through the process, but you do not need to take copious notes at this point as we run through the hypothetical situation. Maybe just a few kind of key little aspects. Now, in this case, Michael lives where the golden-cheeked warbler population is declining. He happens to live in Pleasant Town in the Valley County. Doesn't really matter, it's just a hypothetical anywhere. This particular county is growing rapidly, and a lot of the new development is happening right outside of the city limits. That would be just like in our town and most towns. If a town is growing, most of the growth and development tends to be in the suburbs, this outer area, as we begin to move into the more wilderness areas. The biologists have been studying this particular warbler, and they warned the county officials that if we don't do something, the State and Fish Wildlife Service are going to list it as endangered. So in other words, the bird is probably threatened, but it only lives in this particular area, and said if we don't do something about it, it might become endangered. If it were to become endangered, then state laws come into effect, and that's what they're saying. We may want to pay attention. We may want to do something before the state takes over and they do something. So the county right now has some choices. Several groups joined together. They proposed that the county buy several hundred acres of land. We're just kind of showing up here the idea where the birds are known to breed. Pleasant Town is kind of in yellow right there on the crossroads, and they're proposing this area to be a nature preserve. A lot of the birds are there anyway. It's just some woods now, but if we protect it and don't allow development to happen there, then we may be able to save the warbler population. So let's set it aside as a nature preserve. Sounds pretty reasonable, pretty solid. They propose that we limit development around these preserves. So we have the preserve. Well, you don't want to put big major factories right around it making lots of noise and pollution, which may also drive the birds out. We'll make a preserve, but then we're going to limit, we need to zone around it what can be there. In other words, maybe parks could be around it or even neighborhoods, but we don't want to have big businesses and factories, something making a lot of noise. They get enough petitions to put the issue to a vote. And this is very common. This is the democratic process at work. People get together and say, hey, we need to get this together. We need to get a vote on it. Let's get it out before the people. And you and me, we cast our vote to find out, are we as a town going to do? People happen to own property within this area. Because once again, they said, hey, here's an area, it's already woods, and we should have it. But some people have bought property there. I bought 5 acres there. I like to go hunting there. I'm thinking about making a house out there later, whatever. It's owned by certain people. Maybe the county owns some of it, but not all of it. The property owners have an economic interest in it. I may not own property there, so I'm not as vested, if you will. I can think about it without an emotional connection. But if I actually own property there, now I'm really paying attention to what they want to do because I own some of that, what's going to happen. People that own it believe that they might lose money. If I'm forced to sell it instead of being able to develop it, and even if I get fair share for it, I really wanted to build my house there when I retire, whatever. Other residents don't really like the idea of more government regulations. So some people don't want it to happen because, hey, I actually own some of that land and I don't want to lose my investment, or I don't want to lose the land. I like it. And other people just don't like the idea of the government putting more regulations, more stipulations. They're kind of like, we should be able to do what we think or we decide. Other people support the plan. We're gathering information, right? He's finding out what different people are saying. And they fear that without some of this preserve, without us doing something, the warbler is going to get listed as endangered. And once it's listed as endangered, the state will impose a plan to protect the bird that would require even stricter limits on the land development. So it's a gamble. If we do something now, we may keep the state. Because here's the deal. We, the people, said already, if an animal becomes endangered, the state is required to protect it. That's already on the books. So once it becomes endangered, the county loses a chance to have a decision. So some people are saying, hey, if we don't do something, the state's going to take over because we, the people, have already voted on that one. People live near the preserve think, hey, if it's turned into a reserve, my property value is going to go up. Because everybody wants a backyard that goes right onto a preserve because it's going to be quiet and nice forever. So some people own land in the preserve, they're concerned. Some people just don't want government regulation. Some people say, hey, if we don't do something, the state will come in. And some people say, you know what, I own land right beside it, and that's going to make my land worth more when it happens. And a lot of people are saying, hey, it'd be really nice because if it's developed, it becomes a park, we have a nice place to go hiking. So there's people on every situation. So they can be used to illustrate this decision-making process. Michael is the voter, and he's going to vote just like all of us would. What's going to happen? So let's follow the steps that he does. So that's just the hypothetical situation. The warbler is there. And they propose, let's set aside the land. People on both sides of the opinion. Michael gathers his information. He looks at local news, he reads the newspaper, he just reads up about the golden cheek warblers in general from some websites, and he went so far as to go to a couple of forums where people were meeting. But the first 3 are pretty easy to do, and we do it all the time. Ooh, what's that? My daughter's like on Google. Ooh, it's this, as I do as well. And honestly, the arguments on both sides made sense to him, which is usually the case. You go, well, I can see what you're saying and I can see what you're saying, but I have to make a decision. So he went ahead and he gathered some scientific information that included some graphs showing the population decline. And he notices from the graph the population dropping off. From the year 2002 up to the year 2012, we see a very steep decline of breeding pairs. It's getting down to 20. That's not very many breeding pairs of warblers in the area. So he takes a look at what we have. So he considers the values. He's got information, take a look at everything, his values. He made a table, a basic pro-con, if you will. He looked at the environmental, economic, and recreational value. It's just his decision, what he thought, these are the big ones. The environment's a concern to me, the economy is a concern to me, and, recreational value, for me and even for others. He figured other people might have some other values that they put out, as you might as well, but those were the 3 that he chose to base his decision around. So now he begins to explore the consequences. So he thinks, okay, in the short term, what are the positive and negative consequences? Short term, some people would suffer financially if they actually owned land there, but other people would benefit. So as a county situation, that seemed kind of neutral. Sure, some are going to take a hit, but other people are going to get a benefit. So he sees those as kind of evening out, if you will. He figured if taxpayers had to pay for the preserve, but all residents would have availability to it. The taxpayers are going to pay for it to happen, but because taxpayers, we all get a benefit from it. Instead of some people benefit and some people losing, in this case, everybody would wind up getting a benefit. The short term didn't seem to make much of a difference, but the long-term consequences are what really swayed his mind. He looked at these environmental values, and that was an important factor in his decision. If the warbler became extinct, well, that's somewhat distressing. He doesn't really want to be a part of an entire species going extinct if we could do something about it. And he realized if we protect the habitat now, that it's really going to be less costly than trying to protect it later. If the state has to come in later and then take some of the development out, replant in wood, it's a lot more cost to all the people, and the same kind of thing is going to ultimately happen for much more cost. The long-term consequences he looked at, and he realizes there are benefits as well. Property values were rising very rapidly where there were preserves. Now, Gainesville is a great example of that. We have a lot of places, whether it's Devil's Mill Hopper, San Velasco, Paynes Prairie, Westside Park. There's lots of little parks around. There's a skate park up near where we are with a dog park near it. These things people want in a town. And the more of those a town has, the more valuable the property tends to become. And he said, hey, that's probably a good thing long term for my property as well, for people coming in. And he found that people actually will pay more. Once again, I would rather own a house that's a little bit smaller, but I have all these great places to go to, than have a slightly bigger house, but nowhere to go that's interesting or any fun. Since the county had very little preserved land, he thought creating a reserve would actually be a better long-term economic investment. And also the highly valued aesthetic and recreational benefits, walking trails, places to go camp, etc., would be much better. So he voted in favor of the nature preserve. Short term didn't seem to be much of a bit. Some benefit, some go down, but the long term, he saw everybody benefiting. Sure, a few people may still be ticked off and don't like it, but he felt overall the county would be better off 10, 15, 20 years down the road if we made the decision now. However, someone else could have looked at the table of pros and cons and voted differently. The case is, if you live in an area where there is an animal that's potentially going extinct and there's a vote going to be on the ballot, what are you going to decide? Make sure you go through the model before getting to the polling station. But if you get to the polling station, take enough time to think about it. Don't flip a coin and vote yes or no. Go through the model. Nobody can force you to leave before you're done casting your vote. Now, as you learn more about issues that affect our environment, use this model. Consider your values, consider the values of others, and weigh the pros and cons. But make sure you think of both the short term and the long term. Because short term, one or the other might really look much better. But when we talk about environmental issues, think long term. What is this going to mean 10, 15, 20 years from now? Because that's what we really need to be thinking. That is it. Wraps us up for chapter 2. Take care. We'll see you next time when we start looking about the dynamic Earth.